historians called Emerging Civil War. Our website is on the screen if you're interested. There are more than 30 of us with public history backgrounds, and we're really just out trying to spread the gospel of the Civil War, helping people stay connected with what we see as America's defining event. Kevin and Rob are both contributors to Emerging Civil War, and both of them have books in the book series that Kevin had just mentioned. But the idea is really just to help people stay connected with this great story and its many facets. Our writers come from different backgrounds, they have different writing styles, different interests, and so it's a really neat conversation, and we'd love to have you part of that conversation at emergingcivilwar.com. We have a podcast that we do a couple times a month. We've got a symposium that we do the first weekend of every August. So lots of stuff going on, and the thing that I love most about it is it's a real neat sense of community, so feel free to follow along and be part of that. I'm excited to be here and talk a little bit about Stonewall Jackson, as we'll get into in just a few minutes. I've got a deep personal connection to Jackson and the fields of Manassas, and so I'm excited to be able to share that with you just a little bit today. I love the theme of the conference, resolve and resolution. You can find the clicker here, it's hidden behind my orange juice. So here's what we're going to talk about today. There's the dude, Stonewall Jackson. If any of you know anything about Stonewall Jackson, he's actually built like Kevin, not like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Yeah, Kevin after cake. We'll give it just a little bit. Although I will say Kevin's got one more arm than Jackson had by the end, so he's got that going on. But this is really kind of, when we think about Stonewall Jackson, this is one of the things that comes to mind to people. So it's not the real life person, but the person he's become. And one of the things I want to talk a little bit about today is how this happened. Because I think we sort of do an injustice to not only Jackson, but to anybody in history, to any of these stories in history, if we think of them in those terms rather than in the terms that they really existed in. But when Jackson was growing up, when he attended West Point, he kept this book of aphorisms, little bits of advice that he would see along the way, little sayings, little quotes, and he kept them in the book. And one of his favorites, and I think it sort of defines the model of his life, ties into the theme of the conference. He said, "You may be whatever you resolve to be." And I invite you to think about what that word resolve really means, because that sense of resolve drove him from the humblest of beginnings to becoming literally the most famous Confederate in the world once upon a time. And beyond that, to this. Okay? He grew up in Western Virginia, outside, born in Clarksburg, grew up outside in a place called Weston's Mills. He was orphaned at a very young age, losing both of his parents. Went to live with some bachelor uncles, which was sort of like being raised in Animal House. He manages to thrive, though, and becomes such a good citizen that people elect him constable. You know, again, that resolve to do well and to be a good person. He eventually earns an opportunity to go off to West Point, where he finds himself woefully underprepared for the education they have to offer him. But that sense of resolve drives him to improve, and he goes from being near the bottom of his class toward being near the top of his class. Classmates say if they had a fifth year to the curriculum, he would have graduated at the top, because he was so studious and committed to what he was doing there at West Point. Like so many of his classmates, he goes off to the Mexican War, where he distinguishes himself in battle on 2 separate occasions, getting personal praise from the commander of the Army, Winfield Scott. Comes back to the peacetime Army, sort of languishes in Florida for a little while, but then he gets an invitation to teach at the new Virginia Military Institute. They need a war hero on the faculty, so they invite him to come to Lexington. He's supposed to teach natural history and philosophy. Page turner, let me tell you. Today we would call it physics. Jackson didn't know a thing about physics, okay? But he spends his time memorizing and trying to improve his work as a teacher. And his students call him Tom Fool when he first starts. I mean, he's a joke in the classroom, although you wouldn't say that because the dude had no sense of humor. But over the course of the 10 years, that sense of resolve pushed him to improve. And so by the time he finishes his tenure there, students actually think pretty highly of Major Jackson. Now, it might be because the other course he teaches is artillery instruction. That's what he did during the war. He's brilliant at it. You can't get better education anywhere in the country in artillery than you can at VMI from Major Jackson. And then war breaks out. And eventually he finds himself here on the plains of Manassas, which of course, as you guys know, is an odd name for a really hilly area, the plains of Manassas. But there he is, and that's kind of where our story really starts today. He's one of several generally anonymous brigadier generals in this brand new nascent army. He's been stationed up near Harper's Ferry, where he's had some squabbles over command protocol and stuff like that. But he's been serving under Joe Johnson, who's going to kind of be based more in this area. And when it looks like the Federals are finally moving, Johnson's going to call Jackson and his small army to come join him here at Manassas Junction. And so starting on the 17th of July, Jackson's going to march his guys to Piedmont Station, put them on some trains, first time in American warfare where we're going to use the trains to move troops back and forth. And Jackson's going to get here on the eve of battle. And he says he's on a march to save the country. Okay? That's his attitude. And that's pretty remarkable because he was a guy who did not support secession. He thought that politicians should find some way to keep Virginia in the Union. But once Virginia voted to secede, he said it was time to draw the sword from the scabbard, throw the scabbard away. You know, he was ready to go black flag when it was time to go. So his army gets here. And he's stationed near Blackburn's Ford, and I'm going to turn this room into a battlefield for just a second. We're going to put you guys on the Confederate side, and we're going to put the Federals off here behind me. And I'm not even going to pretend to be a super expert on the Battle of Manassas, because Rob and Kevin will both mock me mercilessly if I even pretend that. My hands are full with the 18 months in Fredericksburg. Right? But, as you guys probably do know, if you guys are the Confederates, you're going to attack the south end of the field, kind of sweeping from your right. Meanwhile, the Federals come up with the same plan where they're going to attack on their right. Okay? Now, if both attacks happen at the same time, we're going to have just a big wheel, and everybody's going to move a big do-si-do. But the Federals get the jump, and they're going to march first. So they're going to launch their attacks on the north side of the battlefield. So down here, there's a brigade of mixed Alabamians, North Carolinians, and Mississippians. And you know you're saying it right if you can say Mississippi in one syllable. Mississippi, you should put it all together. So you got the 4th Alabama, you got the 6th North Carolina, and there's 2 Mississippi regiments, the 2nd and 11th. They're under a guy named Bernard B. B is 37 years old. He's a native Charlestonian from South Carolina, has lived in Texas before he went off to West Point. He graduated 33rd out of a class of 41 in 1945. I'll forget all those numbers tomorrow. And he's had a pretty successful career in the U.S. Army. He also was lauded during the Mexican War, where he was promoted twice, once at Cerro Gordo and again at Chapultepec. He has a pretty successful career in the U.S. Army, stationed in Mississippi. He also is involved with the Mormon Wars out of Utah. But when the South secedes, he goes with his native state of South Carolina. So that's what puts him in this position where he's leading this mixed brigade of Alabamians, North Carolinians, Mississippi. They're down at Blackburn's Ford, and they think they're going to be in on the fight, only to find out that stuff is happening elsewhere. And of course, nobody tells a private what's going on. So a lot of accounts from these guys are like, we're missing out on all the action. And you know, at this point in the war, they all think this is the war. It's going to be today, and it'll be over, and we're going to miss out. But then they get shuffled toward the Stone Bridge, which is sort of kind of in the middle of the battlefield. And they think, oh my gosh, we're going to miss out on the fight. But then they can sort of hear the action that's taking place on the north end of the field. And B marches them to the fight that's going on Matthews Hill. After what historian John Hennessy calls the shortest of pauses, they get themselves together, they throw themselves into the fight. Fight does not go well. They get there sort of at the tail end of it, so they are driven back along with other Confederate forces off Matthews Hill and back down past the stone house and up across Judith Henry's property. And they're driven back. And in the midst of all of this confusion, B gets separated from his brigade. But he sees another brigade coming up onto the Henry Hill Plateau. that had also been stationed at Blackbird's Ford, and that's 4 regiments under a guy named Thomas Jackson, this artillery instructor from VMI. Nobody knows who he is. But B is a little panicked, he's flustered, he's lost his men. He comes up to Jackson and he says, "They're routing us, they're driving us from the field." And Jackson, in what we all come to know is pretty Jacksonian style, says, "Then we shall give them the bayonet, sir." Talk about a dude with no sense of humor, right? And so then, according to the Charleston Mercury, in an article that appears on July 21st, 1861, 4 days after the battle, B is so moved by this encounter that he turns to his brigade and he says, "Men, there stands Jackson like a stone wall. Let us rally around the Virginians. Let us resolve to die here, and we shall conquer." And of course, the Alabamians rush to the aid of the Virginians. The tumbling line of the Confederacy reforms around their position. The tide of battle turns, and Jackson earns the nickname Stonewall Jackson, one of the most famous nicknames in American history. That's how the story comes down to us more than 160 years later. But John Hennessy, whom I mentioned just a few moments ago, a mentor to me and a longtime historian here before he moved down to Fredericksburg, decided to unpack what actually happened. Because first of all, how did the Charleston Mercury get this account? We're still not even sure the provenance of how this ends up in the paper. Because as it turns out, not many people overheard B make his statement. Okay? And the circumstances under which that happened have become a little clouded. According to the Mercury, it's around 12 or 12:30 in the afternoon. Okay? And Jackson is going to help those Alabamians stand firm, except the Alabamians at this point are separated from their commander. Okay? B doesn't know where his Alabamians, North Carolinians, or Mississippians are at this point. Now, for students of the battle, you know that about this time, the Federals, after driving the Confederates off of Matthews Hill, take a time out. They're just as confused as the Confederates were. So they need to get themselves reformed, and that's going to create an opportunity for the Confederates to get themselves reformed. So there's this 2.5-hour pause that the Charleston Mercury doesn't take any account for. Now we're going to start to piece that together with the 4 primary accounts that exist about this incident with B. The most famous was written in 1891 for the Richmond Dispatch, and it was later adapted for the Southern Historical Society Papers, Volume 19. Okay? And it was written by a lieutenant who said he was there and heard it for himself. So I'll do something I hardly ever do here and actually refer to my notes so I can get these quotes right for you. So John Robbins says that Jackson and his glorious brigade were struggling like giants to withstand the fierce onslaught. Well, does that sound like a 2-hour pause to you? No, they're in the thick of the fight. What happens is when Jackson gets to position, his men will actually deploy on the reverse slope of the little ridge that goes along there. And he gets somewhere around 12 guns positioned in that spot. We don't know exactly how many he had, but he's got about 12 pieces of artillery there. And he has his men get down on the reverse slope so that the Federals can't see what they're coming up against. And during this time, B's brigade, among others, are assembling about 500 yards behind Jackson, just looking for some sort of leadership. Another account we'll talk about in just a second talks about how they're leaderless but wanting to do something, but they just don't know what to do. Well, when the Federals finally get their act together and they advance down, they're going to deploy some artillery right along the ridge opposite of Jackson, next to Judith Henry's house. And they're going to be supported by infantry. And those infantry are going to come forward toward Jackson's position. And Jackson's men suddenly spring up, fire a volley. The Federals are like, whoa, and they back off. And then they spend some time getting their act together. The artillery starts doing their thing back and forth. And then the Federal artillery are going to advance again. And this time they're not going to just melt away after the first volley. And there's going to be an intense half-an-hour struggle between Jackson's brigade and these Federals that are coming after him. And this is when these men behind the lines, 500 yards away, talk about this struggling like giants to withstand the onslaught. Okay, so now we've got something that places what's about to happen at about 2:30 in the afternoon or just before 3 o'clock. So B rides up, still looking for his men. He's been looking for his men for almost 2 hours. And he finally comes upon a group of them and he says, "Men, what unit are you?" And they say, "Well, we're the 4th Alabama, General. Don't you recognize us?" But he's so flustered and things have been so confusing. And so finally he tries to get the remnants of his brigade together. And he says, "Men, can you make a charge of bayonets? Yonder stands Jackson like a stone wall. Let's go to his assistance." And this is where Robin says, "I myself was there and heard the words. B will place himself on the left of the regiment and lead them forward." As he's heading toward Jackson's position, some of Jackson's artillery is beginning to withdraw because they're running out of ammunition. Why is this artillery? A battery that's led by the not yet but soon to be gallant John Pelham. And as the artillery comes through, it forces B's men to open like the Red Sea to let them through. B's going to find himself with about 200 guys on the far left and continue to lead them forward as the rest of his brigade pushes off to his right. And as he's leading them forward to get into position on Jackson's right, he's mortally wounded. And Robbins, in his account of this, which was written in reaction to something Jubal Early had written in the newspaper. Now, can you imagine Jubal Early shooting his mouth off over anything really? And so Robbins actually writes, "It is not true that General B said, 'Rally behind the Virginians,' or behind anybody else. It's not true that he was rallying his men at all, for they were not retiring. The glory of the Stonewall Brigade does not need to be enhanced by any depreciation of the equal firmness and heroism of other men on that heroic field." So what Robbins is saying is like, it doesn't diminish the great work that the Stonewall Brigade did, that other brigades were also doing good work. There's glory enough for all. But remember, he's writing this in 1891, so we're 30 years after the war. The Stonewall Brigade and Stonewall Jackson himself have become legendary by this point. And the whole idea of rallying around the Virginians has become gospel among the recounting of the Battle of First Manassas. That goes back to that article that appeared in the Charleston Mercury. "Let us resolve to die here, and we shall conquer." But as it turns out, it's people like Early and other Virginians who've been pushing that story. And for a long time, it was a very active group of Virginians pushing this idea that Jackson and his men came to the rescue of B's mixed brigade. Well, then 3 other accounts showed up. And all 4 of these existing accounts tend to jive with each other pretty well. Some of the details are a little off, but Captain Thomas Goolsby of the 4th Alabama, in his official report, which never makes it into the ORs, but it did make it into the Richmond Times-Dispatch on August 17, 1861. And it sat in this newspaper for decades and decades and decades, and nobody noticed it. But Goolsby says, again, he's talking about after coming off of Matthew Hill, he says, "We again fell back through a pine wood to an open field where we halted and awaited orders. The thirst of the men was intense and almost intolerable. And you can go stand in that open field today. Amid the bursting of shells and the rattling storm of musketry, our heroic General B rode up to the regiment and inquired what body of troops we were. Being told that it was what remained of the 4th Alabama, he replied with an expressive gesture, which I can only imagine what that must have been. "This is all of my brigade I can find. Will you follow me back to where the firing is going on?" "To the death," was the response. Retiring artillery split the regiment. The part not with B marched straight through the wood, exposed at every step to a galling fire. And then B was shot down. Gouldsby makes no mention of "there stands Jackson like a stone wall," let alone rallying around anyone or resolving to die anywhere. A man who heard it, had to report it, says nothing about it. The chaplain of the 4th Alabama also overheard B's exchange. He wrote in his diary less than a week after the battle, and he likewise says nothing about "there stands Jackson like a stone wall." Gouldsby and the chaplain, his name's James G. Hudson, they're writing within a week of the incident, and neither of them mention Stonewall anything. What they say is, "Will you go with me?" And the response is, "To the death." The chaplain's diary echoes those same things that Gouldsby's account does. The final account comes from an unpublished regimental history that was written in 1909 by Robert Coles. And he has B saying, in highly dramatic flourish, "Come with me and go yonder where Jackson stands like a stone wall." And that doesn't seem to have the rhetorical flourish, does it? Okay? So if we're going to inscribe something on the side of a monument, do we want "come and go yonder"? Okay? Or do we want "rally around the Virginians"? Especially if we are Virginians putting up this monument. Right? Okay. And so this idea, like this creation of this folk hero, really comes out of that story from the Charleston Mercury, which doesn't have strong provenance as far as where it comes from. And then it's perpetuated by the Virginians of the Stonewall Brigade specifically, none of whom were around Bernard B. when he allegedly said this. And he, of course, B is shot down. He's the highest ranking Confederate officer to be killed in the battle. And so we never get to ask him afterwards. So tell me, what did you mean by that? Now, one criticism for people who are not Stonewall Jackson fanboys, as I am, is that maybe B was insulting Jackson. You know, he's not doing anything. He's just standing there like a stone wall, right? But if we think about these circumstances, he's in the midst of this heavy firefight, struggling like giants against the onslaught. Okay? He's holding his own when this happens. So obviously the circumstance does put him in a spot where he's standing firm like he should be, not dragging his feet. It's not an insult. Other evidence to suggest that this is a compliment, not an insult, is the men of Jackson's brigade embrace the nickname Stonewall Brigade. They are super proud of this designation. Now, do you think if it was an insult, they'd be like, yes, call us that, you know? No, I mean, and it's such an honorific that eventually, as the war goes on, members of the whole division want to be the Stonewall Division so that they can just bask in the reflected glory of Jackson's action on Henry House Hill. One of the successors to Jackson in command of the brigade is a guy named James Walker, who had been a student of Jackson's at VMI just before the war. And because of an incident in class, Jackson had Walker kicked out of VMI just before graduation, which ticked Walker off so much that he challenged Jackson to a duel. And the superintendent of VMI had to kind of extricate Jackson, who suddenly, he didn't know this code dwell-out stuff. Like, Walker hated Jackson. He was telling Richard Ewell during the Valley Campaign, we used to call him Tom Fool back at school. When Walker becomes commander of the Stonewall Brigade, the men start calling him Stonewall Jim because he's a hard fighter. And he embraces that nickname. Now, do you think he wants to take on a nickname of a guy he loathes? No. He understands what an honor that nickname is. So these are all, I think, bits of contextual evidence that help us understand that nobody's insulting Jackson by standing there like a stone wall, not moving. And he's in the thick of the fight, holding firm when this happens. So his name appears in the newspaper, but he tells everybody, the name belongs to the men, not to me. He's very much like the glory goes to God. He's a highly religious man. He does not want any credit for this. He's embarrassed to have his name in the paper, although it's sort of like, no. There's a little of that going on. But really, though, he's still an anonymous brigadier general. Nobody knows who he is. If you remember, Jefferson Davis comes to the battlefield right afterwards, and he's like, who will follow me to chase these ruffians back to Washington? And Jackson leaps up and says, 3 cheers for Jefferson Davis, which is super uncharacteristic. But then he says, if you give me the army, I will chase these men back into Washington and destroy them. Now, Bud Robertson, Jackson's great biographer, says Davis was hard of hearing and probably didn't even hear what Jackson had to say. Okay? I sort of think Davis is probably like, yeah, okay, sure, right? Okay? Who is this nutball saying this? Ironically, if this was the Jackson 2 years later saying this, it would be kind of amazing because he'd have been dead by then. But if it was the Jackson of 18 months later saying, I'll lead these men into Washington, you can bet you Jefferson Davis would have paid attention to him. Okay, such had Jackson's reputation grown over those 18 months. Okay? But right now, he's just sort of like this folk hero. But now we finally got the birth of the nickname. So what does he do with it? See, I'm never used to doing PowerPoints, and here I made these fine folks. There's B. Here's Jackson, standing like a wax museum figure, okay? And again, this kind of goes back to like, what are we dealing with? Like, anybody remember the old wax museum in Gettysburg? And this is where I first met Stonewall Jackson as a kid. And this is supposed to be Bernard B. over here, pointing at Jackson. There he is, standing there. Okay? So this is our dramatic Bernard B. action here. So we jump ahead to the winter. January, Jackson is back in Winchester. He decides to go poke at some Federals who are threatening the western door of Virginia, marches his men out through this miserable storm. It's legendarily epic in its awfulness. Okay? And what do the soldiers have to say about the fabulous Stonewall Jackson at this point? Well, before he marches them out, a member of the Stonewall Brigade writes a letter to the Stanton Spectator. I have read of the devotion of soldiers to their commanders, but history contains no parallel case of devotion and affection to that of Major General Jackson in the Stonewall Brigade. You can already hear this. Wow, right? We do not look upon him as a severe disciplinarian, as a politician, as a man seeking popularity, but as a Christian, a brave man, possessing moral courage unequaled by any predecessor or contemporary, as a man who appreciates the condition of a common soldier, as a fatherly protector, as one who endures all hardships in common with his followers, as one who never commands others to face danger without putting himself in the van. Possessing all these noble qualities, who can help admiring him? Listen to this. Whenever the call of our country meets us, the voice of our much beloved general is heard. And we are ready to assist and follow. Whenever our country calls, we hear our general's voice. Like, that's a pretty big thing to say. The Richmond Times-Dispatch in January talks about the late operations of General Jackson in Berkeley County. They've been entirely important and successful. But look at this for a moment. a copy of which you can purchase out in the hallway, by the way, it's out there. Here's what the soldiers, here's what this dude right here is saying. Sam Watkins, who writes one of the great memoirs of the war, he happens to be in the East for this one campaign before it gets sent back west. The soldiers in the whole army got rebellious, almost mutinous, and would curse and abuse Stonewall Jackson. In fact, they call him Full-Time Jackson. They blame him for the cold weather, they blame him for everything. And when he would ride by a regiment, they would take occasion, sotto voce, to abuse him and call him Full-Time Jackson, loud enough for him to hear. Soldiers from all commands would fall out of the ranks and stop on the roadside and swear they'd not follow any leader such any longer. Jackson's chief of staff, Robert Louis Dabney, in his adoring biography of Jackson, said, "The larger number professed to depreciate his capacity, and not a few declared that he was manifestly mad. They said that the man had personal disregard of danger, a hardihood of temper, and a stubbornness, which made him a good fighter where he was guided by a wiser head. That he was competent to lead a brigade well on a parade ground in the battlefield, but had no capacity adequate to the management of a separate command and an extensive district. That he was headstrong, and that his headstrong and unreasonable zeal, with his restless thirst for distinction, thrust him into enterprises which he lacked discretion to conduct or to preposterous issue. He lacked discretion to conduct to a preposterous issue, and that it was only good fortune or the better judgment of his reluctant subordinates in lagging behind his rash intentions that saved his army from catastrophe." Now again, thinking back to what we know about the Stonewall Brigade and Stonewall Jackson, whose men loved him and all that stuff, are these accounts of people who are in love with their commander? Everything was fine and good when you're winning at Manassas, but now that things have turned bad, and Jackson doesn't tell subordinates what's going on. He was super secretive, one of his flaws as a commander. So nobody knows what's going on. He's just marching through the wilderness, and it's terrible. The roads are terrible, and he doesn't care. The mission is everything, and the men don't respond well. So they get to Romney, they drive the Federals away, but it's such an awful experience that many of his officers begin to revolt, led by William Wing Loring, who's a one-armed Mexican war hero, a malcontent in an army full of malcontents. He will eventually earn the nickname Old Blizzards at Fort Pemberton during the early months of the Vicksburg campaign, because he tells his artillerists, "Give him the blizzards, give him the blizzards." And they start calling him Old Blizzards, which is ironic because he doesn't have that nickname yet. But he starts sending notes to the War Department saying, "This guy's crazy, he's got us out here, he's starving us, we're going through deprivations, this is just more than is called for." And he encourages a number of Jackson's subordinates, including William Tolliver and Sam Fulkerson of the 37th Virginia, and they start writing letters to Richmond too. Tolliver goes and meets with the Secretary of War, and then goes and meets with Jefferson Davis. And if we're just thinking about chain of command and Army protocol, this is a terrible breach of protocol on Davis's part as well as Tolliver's. But Tolliver comes back to Loring and he says, "Jackson's prestige is gone. Public sentiment's against him. The leading men have asked me if Jackson's not deficient in mind." Jackson, getting wind of all this, sends in his resignation. So "I'm not putting up with this. Send me back to BMI." And his friend, Governor Letcher, intervenes, gets in his command. Joe Johnson, his commander, says, "I don't know how a general of his capacity will be supplied. We have to keep him." Okay? And so they reject Jackson's resignation. They reshuffle some of the command. Fulkerson, ironically, doesn't get into any trouble for this. He'll get killed at Gaines Mill in just a few months. And Jackson will actually cry when he hears about Fulkerson's death. He really likes Fulkerson a lot. Fulkerson's doing the étude brute in his back behind the scenes. So this becomes a really troublesome time for Jackson. And then finally, by March, he's looking to go on the offense. The roads are a little better. And he tries to attack federal forces in Winchester, just outside of Winchester, Kernstown, on the 25th of May. That very day, the Stanton Spectator is writing about General Jackson's famous Stonewall Brigade, the very name of which has become a terror to the enemy. And this is a little kind of whistling past the graveyard at this point, because Jackson hasn't done a whole lot to strike terror into the hearts of enemy. But then words of the disaster Kernstown start trickling back to the newspapers in Richmond. On the 27th, the Richmond Times-Dispatch writes, "We've not yet received full and authentic accounts of the fight near Winchester. It was a gallant feat of arms on the part of Old Stonewall. The initial report was that Jackson had been deceived by a traitor who misrepresented the number and locality of the enemy, and that he was caught in an ambush. As more details begin to take shape, the media begins to cast around for explanations or excuses. They try to excuse this away. It was not a defeat, it was a drawn battle," one newspaper writes. "Jackson only made the attack in obedience to orders," another says. "Well, if Jackson had had a few thousand more men," another article says. The Times-Dispatch played a little rhetorical footwork and shifted emphasis to coverage of the Stonewall Brigade instead of Stonewall Jackson himself. "They have fairly earned the title won by their sturdy and unconquerable valor at Manassas, the Stonewall Brigade. Kernstown was another striking illustration of their bulldog courage." And then the press tried to play up Jackson's withdrawal from Kernstown down the valley toward Mount Jackson, and talking about it being a masterful withdrawal. So they're really trying to de-emphasize the defeat that he has suffered, which is then, from a public opinion perspective, going to help him out. "Let every man now rally to the standard of the heroic Jackson," the Dispatch wrote on May 31st, just 6 days after the battle. The media also portrays him as God-fearing, which helps his reputation, and that helps him weather this disaster at Kernstown. On April 4th, the Richmond Times-Dispatch printed a profile sent in by a proselytizer visiting the camp. "At the prayer meeting, that gallant soldier and pious man, General Stonewall Jackson, was present and led in prayer. It is certainly a gratifying fact that General Jackson is an active, humble, consistent Christian, restraining profanity and Sabbath-breaking." What did the men think? Here again, we're going to start to see a divide between the guys in the Stonewall Brigade and other men under Jackson's command. And those other men under Jackson's command see Jackson giving his own brigade favoritism, even though there's a lot of evidence to suggest they have it worse. And they start calling the Stonewall Brigade the Mud Fence Brigade, and they call them Jackson's pets. But someone in the Stonewall Brigade from the Rockbridge Artillery sends a letter to the Richmond Dispatch on April 2nd. "It's useless to say that General Jackson acted bravely." So of course he was. "He was in the thickest of the fight and exposed to every danger. A braver man God never made." But it's interesting to note that when the Stanton Spectator reprinted parts of that letter on April 8th, they left that observation about Jackson out. So now we're starting to see some cracks in the facade. Okay? Is he all he's cracked up to be? Is he all that in a bag of chips? Yeah, now we're starting to see things. It's a quiet spring. According to Bud Robertson, at the moment, in high Confederate circles around Richmond, Jackson had a shaky reputation, if he had a reputation at all. But he does have enough reputation they name a ship after him. March 25th, this is a paddle wheel steamer as part of the fleet defending New Orleans. It's a cotton-clad, you can see cottons around the engine house and stuff like that. It's launched on March 25th, 1862. It has a career that lasts all of about 5 days. It's damaged in the battles for New Orleans. It rams a federal ship, and in the process damages itself and gets run aground and set aflame. So the illustrious career of Stonewall Jackson of the Mississippi does not go so well. But things for Jackson himself are about to get a lot better. And I put these dates together so as we start to talk about some of this stuff, we've got some context, because everything that happens here informs everyone's reaction about what happens here. Look at where the Confederacy is in the spring of '62. That is not a great list of fabulous successes for the Confederacy, is it? Territory is shrinking all across the board. Even in the Trans-Mississippi, there are two state capitals, Tennessee and Louisiana, that fall. Ulysses S. Grant has been stabbing all the way down through the heart of the Mississippi Valley. And now we have the Federal Navy pushing up from the south. Joe Johnson, who is easy for us to make fun of, but he's a hero of the Confederacy. He's wounded. So all of this calamity means bad news everywhere. So when Jackson's going to start ticking off victories over here on the right, we've finally got a bright spot we can look at. Okay. First, the Battle of McDowell on May 8th. And when the Richmond Times-Dispatch starts reporting that on the 12th, they talk about brave and self-reliant Jackson, who has high principles of morality. When the campaigns of General Jackson shall be written, we do not doubt that encouraged vigilance, care of his men, knowledge of his ground, and capacity for sustaining himself under difficulties, he'll be found inferior to no general commanding a Confederate army. Whew, that's a lot to place on someone after the Battle of McDowell, right? The article goes on to compare him to no other general except for the Washington of the West, Sterling Price. Wow, what company, huh? On the 14th, the Richmond Times-Dispatch, in one of the most ironic descriptions, talks about the invulnerable Stonewall Jackson. Ask him about that on the morning of May 3rd, 1863, how invulnerable he was feeling. But here the press is starting to play him up. His officers, at this point, don't like him at all. You know, that revolt we talked about in January, morale in the officer corps is still pretty stressed out. Richard Taylor, who comes to join Jackson, calls him this damned old crazy fool. Richard Ewell, who comes to join Jackson, says he's as crazy as a March hare. He's gone away, he's not told me where he's going. He's left me instructions to stay until he returns. But Nathaniel Banks' whole army is advancing on me. I tell you, sir, he is crazy, and I'll just march my division away from here. I do not mean to have it cut to pieces on the behest of a crazy man. In other correspondence, you will call them a crazy fool, an idiot, and an enthusiastic fanatic. Charles Winder, one of Jackson's division commanders, is disgusted. He calls Jackson insane. An officer in the 10th Virginia says Jackson is killing up all my men. Only half of them are fit for duty. But the soldiers, as I said earlier, victory forgives a lot. And the soldiers saw that victory at McDowell as like, okay, maybe you're not completely crazy. We're getting used to Jackson's divergences from the straight road. And a member of the 13th Virginia says that as they're heading into Front Royal, where they're going to pick up another victory, we took up a shout and gave a hearty greeting to the great captain who had come to lead us to victory. And the mountains echoed and re-echoed with the great acclaim. And on May 23rd, he'll score a victory at Front Royal. May 25th, he'll score a victory at Winchester. On that very day, the Richmond Dispatch was predicting there's no probability that old Stonewall will permit the Yankees to stagnate during their sojourn in the valley if he's permitted to continue his operations against them. The news talked about the honest hero Jackson. The bandwagon effect starts to roll. All honor to him and his heroes. 3 battles has he already fought in this campaign, all brilliant. The last, Winchester, eminently successful. The whole country is full of praise of him and his indomitable army. The whole country is right. Another paper says, glorious old Stonewall is fast becoming the hero of the war. May his shadow never be less. The Richmond Whig says, everybody says hurrah for old Stonewall. If our generals will do like old Stonewall, we'll soon have our hands full of torchlight demonstration and jollifications generally. Who doesn't love a word like jollifications? Okay. Now think about this. So we've had 3 victories, McDowell, Front Royal, and Winchester. He's becoming the hero of the war by May 27th. Well, look at all this that's going on. There aren't any heroes anyplace else. Okay? The Richmond Times-Dispatch says the tidings for Jackson are better and better. That old Turk has played the very devil with Banks and his slubber-digillions. Another great word. He's mashed them at both ends and pierced them in the center. Good. Very good. But note how high the hopes are that start riding on him. Because of all this, and because all the attention the Valley campaign is getting, that's the horse that's going to win the race. The success of Jackson opens a glorious vista of possibilities. The land of the enemy is just ahead of them. Their capital, that nest of uncleared birds, within reach. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, their great military and commercial highway at his feet. What may he not do? No one doubts that he will do all that his energy, daring vigilance, and sublime devotion can accomplish. Another newspaper report in June said that if Jackson had the force that some of our generals have commanded, he would, by this time, have captured the North Pole and extinguished the Northern Lights. From Winchester, he chases Federals all the way up into past Harper's Ferry and into Maryland. And then he finds that he's got Confederate forces converging on his rear from Shields and Fremont. So he's got to march all the way back down from Harper's Ferry. The roads are muddy. It's an incredible feat of his foot cavalry. They march 34 miles in a day to escape this converging trap. And they get to Strasburg in safety. And this is where things turn for his men. Old Jack knows what he's about, one of them writes. He'll take care of us, you bet. And another says, from that hour, we never doubted. So all the grumbling in the ranks, from all the marching and the deprivations, all the cold from around me, victory forgives a lot. Right? The press is already playing it up for these reasons we've talked about, but now the soldiers are really starting to come around. And then June 8th and 9th, he has the double victories across Key and Port Republic. 2 days later, the Richmond Dispatch prints a report from the Lynchburg Republican. It said that the wildest enthusiasm exists among the people of the valley at the presence of our armies, and they're flocking to the standard of Old Stonewall in large numbers. So now we're seeing public opinion really start to turn in the valley. In a different column that same day, the paper wrote, Jackson's brilliant achievements since the Battle of McDowell resemble the ticking of a clock. So rapid and regular are they. It gives us vertigo of delight to think of what Jackson has done. We hope he'll keep on and give us an apoplexy before he stops, but we don't want him to stop. The Richmond Examiner likened Jackson to a gamecock, and he does wheel with a vengeance. He cuts and comes again, which reminded the paper of that queer and terrible Australian implement which deals death and destruction by the upward and unexpected, unward-offable prospect of circumbendus. Let Jackson be called the Confederate boomerang. And by this point, it's not just in Virginia. It's not just the Valley. It's not just Virginia. Mobile, Alabama on June 3rd. Stonewall's name is truly a tower of strength and battle cry of victory. In our night of trial, it first heralds the dawn of deliverances and successes and sends a thrill of electric life to the despondent and downhearted. In Macon, Georgia, later in June, the revolution has at last found a great captain. He is Stonewall Jackson. No man can have watched him for the past month and doubt it. After recounting the Valley campaign, the paper said, who, in the face of these facts, can doubt that we have, at last, found a man destined to play a leading and historical part in the drama of the Second Revolution, and to inspire the army and the people with new confidence in the successes and glory of our arms. Ironically, at this point, coverage of Jackson he becomes so exuberant that he begins to overshadow people like Turner Ashby, Richard Ewell, who used to be mentioned in these dispatches because nobody knew who the real great hero was going to be in this campaign. But as Jackson continues to lead them on, guys like Turner Ashby and Ewell, Edward Johnson begin to fade away. And then, because Jackson has assumed these larger-than-life proportions, the newspapers start using him in ways that are like propaganda. Okay? So he stops being a person and starts to become an icon. They mock Northerners in the Richmond Whig in June, which publishes a mock proclamation from Confederate President Jefferson Davison for the suppression of land pirates, wolves, noxious insects, and repugnant vermin, naming Jackson, better known as Stonewall, or sometimes as Old Stonewall, accent on old, for having, without color of laws or titles, vested, required, appropriated to his own use, behoof, usurped to advantage, sundry the goods, chattels, canyons, teams, munitions, blah, 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 in violation of the hospitality we've been trying to show Nathaniel Banks, Robert Gilroy, James Shields, and John Fremont, citizens of the United States and subjects of His Serene Highness, our well-beloved brother and most noble friend, Abraham Lincoln. They're basically saying Jackson's doing all this nasty stuff to all these Federals. Huzzah. In June, an abolitionist newspaper in D.C. called The New Era reported that Irving McDowell had got Stonewall Jackson completely hemmed in with his large force, thus cutting off all possible chance of escape. Too bad for poor Stonewall, the Richmond Dispatch lamented. Just in the zenith of his fame, thus headed off his grand march to Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and all the other northern cities upon which he's promised to visit his vengeance. The follow-up report, the loss of General Jackson's entire command, 9,000 prisoners. But here's the twist. Old Stonewall is in blissful ignorance of his own capture and ruin, having had the audacity on Monday last to attack Shields and thrash him like all wrath after having slightly knocked Fremont into a cocked hat. In fact, the worst part of the whole thing, said a witness, was that Jackson had driven the enemy from Winchester and taken 200 gallons of castor oil, which she fears will be the death of him. Well, Rob left the room for this one. I got some trash talking at Robert E. Lee. They used Stonewall Jackson to trash talk Robert E. Lee. On June 12th, what's Lee doing at that point? He's fortifying the Confederate capital, right? Earning his nickname, the Queen of Spades. In a front-page editorial on June 12th, the Richmond Rig wrote a piece called Fighting Against Spading. Old Stonewall Jackson, as he's called, although but 38 years old, is not only teaching some unpleasant lessons to the enemy, but he's inculcating some of our own generals, to which it is hoped will not be lost on them. He's teaching them that war is something more than ditching, and that battles cannot be won without fighting. He's one of the few who do not suffer the grass to grow under their horses' hooves, while others who count their armies by the hundreds of thousands squat down within a few hundred yards of the enemy, meeting trench with trench and making no hostile demonstration. He is moving, fighting, winning victories, and making himself and his army illustrious. Jackson scorns such ignoble policy. Oh, for a dozen Jacksons. Let our generals learn before it's too late that the way to win professional reputation, to gain the love and confidence of the troops, and to put an end to this ruinous war is to fight, not to spade, to advance and not retreat. This is mid-June. By this point, Jackson's transformation from random, unknown brigadier general at Manassas to icon has been cemented in the public's mind, among his men, and starting among his officers, some of which are still holding out. But Richard Ewell says, "Do you remember when I called Jackson an old woman? Well, I take it all back." But his quartermaster, John Harmon, someone Jackson really respected, despite Harmon's legendary profanity, in the middle of June says, "Jackson's mysterious ways are unbearable. He's a hard master to serve, and nothing but a mean-spirited man can remain long with him. God be with us all." And Jackson will continue to have conflict with his commanders throughout the rest of the war. That's a whole other talk. But at different points of the war, he'll have 23 of his subordinates under arrest. Okay? That's the one place that he doesn't warm the cockles of a lot of people's hearts. But by this point, he is literally the most famous Confederate in the world because of this ruin and that success. On June 11th, the Times-Dispatch in Richmond talked about its own change of heart. "Some time ago, we accused Jackson of being unsound in mind. Since that time, he's exhibited not the least symptom of improvement. In fact, he gets worse and worse every day. Within the last 2 weeks, he seems to have gone clean daft, quite crazy, crazy as a bedbug, crazy as 2 bedbugs. With foot cavalry at his heels, with their tails curled, he's been raving, ramping, roaring, rearing, snorting, and cavorting up and down the valley, chawing up Yankees by the thousands as if they were so many grains of parched popcorn. The Lord sent that he may never recover his senses till his foot cavalry were stabled in the big barns in the Susquehanna Valley. Crazy or not, we but echo the voice of the whole Confederacy when we say, God bless old Stonewall. God bless him 1,000 times over, and all the gallant fellows they so skillfully command. God bless them all. What a remarkable transformation. And so then we get this. He connects with Robert E. Lee, sleeps through the 7 days, which he's able to do because of his success in the Valley. Lee knows his worth, and so he does not banish Jackson the way he sends away Theophilus Holmes, who underperforms, or John Magruder, who underperforms. He sticks with Jackson despite nearly disastrous underperformance in the 7 days. And he will string together a series of victories, starting at Cedar Mountain, here at 2nd Manassas, Harper's Ferry, off to Antietam, down to Fredericksburg, off to Chancellorsville, where he rides off into legend. He dies at his Jimi Hendrix moment, the peak of his fame and power and talent. He leaves that army disastrously split in the face of a numerically superior, angry foe. He doesn't have to deal with the consequences of his successful flank attack. Instead, he becomes legend. Okay? And so he starts selling Coca-Cola. You know? The pause that refreshes. It's actually hung in the boardroom of Coke's corporate office. He becomes more than a person. He becomes this icon. He becomes this legend. So we get all this kind of stuff, right? I mean, he's not in the ground 6 months. He gets his face on an apple. Come on. He's in the ground 6 months. And admirers in England raised money for this statue, which is standing on the grounds of the Virginia Capitol. He gets his own hotel. He gets his own band. You know, he gets his own wine, which is great because he didn't drink. I've smoked Stonewall Jackson cigars. He didn't smoke. Okay, he takes on his life of his own. We get a lot of praying Jacksons. Okay, that's another sort of way people like to use him and think of him in memory, and kind of this one of his many hats that he wears. I love this painting down here because here's Jackson in camp. Everyone's praying. Someone is so moved to tears. And then down here in the corner, you have A.P. Hill, who could not be more bored. Dick Ewell's like, oh, what am I doing here? That's my daughter. The daughter who got married and kept me from being here. When she was 6, she dressed up as Stonewall Jackson for Halloween. Like, we today use this icon in ways that are important to us. I think about that idea of resolve, and Jackson may be whatever we resolve him to be because of all these different ways that we use him. But this idea of family kind of leads to my last thought that I want to leave you with. Is Jackson's assumed these larger-than-life proportions. You know, we have Ares, the god of war, on a Budweiser Clydesdale, a couple miles down the road from him. Okay? But that's not who he was. He was somebody's husband. He was somebody's father. Julia was 6 months old when her dad died. She grew up never knowing her dad. That's a personal tragedy. The whole Confederacy mourned Jackson's death. The whole North was like, whew, that's over with, right? This is a personal tragedy. Julia grows up knowing the Jackson that we know, you know, sort of this mythical character. And so as we think about the story of Jackson and what he's become and what we do with him and how we use him and how we remember him, and we do this with so many aspects of the war, these are people just like us, with families just like us. Remember that whoever this person is that we've made, these are all personal tragedies, and it is our responsibility to remember them as such. Thank you. We have time for questions? We have time for questions? Anybody? I know Rob's like, beer's getting warm. No questions. Thank you all for being with us here today. Appreciate your support of the symposium. And any final announcements?
Yes, thank you to all of you for coming out today. We'd also just like to extend a big thank you to all our presenters. Can we get just another hand to everybody who presented today? And we also want to extend a special thank you to the Manassas Museum for hosting us here today and their new renovated space. We're really thankful to have this here and extends collaboration for the 9th annual symposium. I will be bugging all of you in the next couple of days with an email survey. We'd love to hear how we did, what you think we could do better with the symposium, what you enjoyed, and we're hoping to bring it back, of course, for the 10th annual symposium next year. So thank you all again for coming. We look forward to seeing you at future Prince William County events. Thanks.